G'day and welcome back to Aussie AFA history, a kind of a rough patchwork quilt I'll be intermittently attempting to sew of various anti-fascist actions to have taken place in Australia, both new and old. And for this one we're going right back to the late 1930s for some of the earliest action against political fascism to have been held here. This is an extraordinarily early anti-Nazi protest against the brutality and attempted genocide of the German Nazi regime. And we're looking in particular at William Cooper. Now, Cooper is a legendary Indigenous activist. He had form as a campaigner for Aboriginal land rights right back to the late 1880s, participating in petitions and deputations to governors and government bodies demanding citizenship and land rights for Indigenous people. But for most of his working life, he was off employed as a drover and a shearer and as a general farm labourer all up and down the eastern seaboard of Australia and a little bit in South Australia as well. But as he reached his 70s, he settled into the western suburbs of Melbourne, personally beloved by me, moving to Footscray, my heart's home, in the mid-1930s. And he actually lived all around various different homes in Seddon and Footscray over this time. But Cooper didn't retire gently. Instead, he became a dedicated activist. He helped to found the Australian Aborigines League to consolidate these political efforts of his and the activists around him, and he became its secretary. Now, the AAL was a coordinated lobbying group which aimed to effect political change on behalf of Indigenous people to, agitate for land rights, Indigenous representation in Parliament, to challenge politicians to consider the ongoing persecution of Indigenous people. On the 26th of January 1938, Cooper helped to organise a day of mourning protest in Sydney, which was a direct challenge really to the anniversary celebrations which were organised there to celebrate the landing of Captain Arthur Phillip. You can draw a direct line through history from that day of mourning action to modern day Invasion Day and Survival Day events, also on January the 26th. But Cooper's day of mourning action also led to the eventual formation of NAIDOC. So important stuff historically. Meanwhile, abroad, in that same year of 1938, the storm clouds that would later lead to World War II were busily gathering in Germany, although it would take Hitler's invasion of Poland to formally spark the war proper. A real turning point, however, came after Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, which was a wave of anti-Semitic riots across Germany and Austria on November the 9th and 10th of 1938. Jewish synagogues, Jewish-owned businesses, and even cemeteries were destroyed wholesale. Jews were attacked in their houses and humiliated on the street, and scholarship suggests that, in fact, hundreds of Jewish people were murdered over those two nights. In the immediate aftermath of those riots, the Nazi regime quickly began legislating against the freedom rights of Jewish people faster than they'd ever done before, because they'd been shown, after all, that German people were ready to accept more brutal, radical measures after tolerating the events of Kristallnacht. Although Germany tried to suppress a lot of media getting out that documented the specific brutalities of those riots, the world did watch on. US President Franklin Roosevelt condemned the riots at the time.
President Roosevelt, in a statement without precedent, speaks out against the persecution of minorities in Germany. He says he could scarcely believe such things could occur.
Roosevelt also called for an international conference in July 1938 in France to discuss policy plans with respect to the dramatically increasing waves of Jewish refugees who were trying to escape Nazi-occupied Germany and Austria. The Australian delegate to that conference was one Colonel Thomas Walter White. And at the conference, he clarified that Australia's position on accepting Jewish migration in additional amounts was to refuse it outright. He said, "It will no doubt be appreciated also that, as we have no real racial problems, we are not desirous of importing one." Australia in 1938 actually had a fucking abundance of very deeply ingrained racial problems. Chiefly among these was that it was a radically white supremacist settler colonial state, which made for its very first ever piece of legislation, the White Australia policy, which intended to ban all non-white immigration, while the attempted genocide on the Indigenous population continued through policies of forced assimilation and the like. It was many of these very policies that the AAL was attempting to contest. Beyond Colonel White's refusal to accept more Jewish refugees, it is important to note that many political leaders were still in a very public love affair with fascism come 1938. The British royals had been fascinated with the Nazis throughout the 1930s. Here's young Lizzie being taught by her parents to Sieg Heil. In the year of Kristallnacht, our then Prime Minister Joseph Lyons was still revelling in his firm friendship with Benito Mussolini, and the next Prime Minister after him, Robert Menzies, was still telling everyone how much he admired Adolf Hitler. So suffice to say that a month after Kristallnacht, nobody in power in Australia had officially done anything to condemn the rapidly escalating attacks on Jewish people by the Nazis, and that is where Cooper comes in. On the 3rd of December 1938, there was a notice in Melbourne's Argus newspaper announcing that the AAL was going to be marching on the German consul the very next week. The AAL's resolution stood against, and I quote, the cruel persecution of the Jewish people by the Nazi government of Germany, and asking that this persecution be brought to an end. On Tuesday the 6th of December, a group of AAL members and supporters gathered at Cooper's house, which doubled as the de facto AAL headquarters at Southampton Street in Footscray. The average temperature in the 1938-1939 summer was 33.5 degrees, making it a particularly hot one, but the delegation marched dressed in suits nonetheless. Cooper was 77 years of age at the time of the walk and apparently ill, but he walked the entire distance anyway. Their walk took them right up from what we now know as West Footscray, through the guts of Footscray itself and North Melbourne, right into the CBD and to the German consul in Melbourne, which back in 1938 was located at 419 to 425 Collins Street. And when they reached the building, the German consulate, what else, shut the door. The AAL was not admitted. An Argus column the next day read, a deputation from the Australian Aborigines League, which visited the German consulate yesterday, with the intention of conveying to the consul a resolution condemning the persecution of Jews and Christians in Germany, was refused admittance. A letter requesting Dr. Drexler to forward the resolution to his government was left at the consulate. It was not only the first deputation or group in Australia, government or no, to formally publicly condemn the Nazi regime, but it was also likely the world's first formal protest by a private organisation or group or individual against Nazism to take place before the events of World War II, which is nothing short of incredible. Recognition of what Cooper did in formally speaking out about the Nazis before anyone else, mostly, certainly here, has been slow to start but has gradually accumulated over time. His letter remained formally undelivered until the 6th of December 2012, exactly 74 years on from that day in 1938. Cooper's then 84-year-old grandson, Alf Turner, who lived with Cooper for a time when he was young, participated in a reenactment of the walk. There's actually been a few reenactment walks in the last decade since then. That walk culminated in handing over a replica of the protest letter to the consul. This time, they took the letter. In 2020, the German government issued an apology officially for the refusal to accept that letter back in 1938.
On behalf of the government of Chancellor Angela Merkel, we are sorry that the 1938 Consul General in Melbourne would not accept the letter of the Aborigines League, nor forward it on to the political leadership here in Berlin, as would have been the right and morally correct thing for a consular official to do. The solidarity shown at the other end of the world with people in greatest trouble is a role model and impressive until today. Unfortunately, there were very few examples like this.
In March 2018, a bronze statue of William Cooper was unveiled at the Queen's Gardens in Shepparton, so you can go there if you want to pay your respects to a real one. Or you can go and visit the Jewish Holocaust Centre, where a plaque to the deputation and Cooper's protest was unveiled in 2002. You can't move past this great act without acknowledging that Cooper and the AAL absolutely intended, in drawing attention to the plight of the Jews, to highlight the fact that the tactics of displacement, refusal of property rights, dehumanisation and brutality that had been taking place in Germany up to that time had also taken place in Australia. In remembering Cooper's efforts, you cannot ignore that bit. In 1999, the incredible Gary Foley submitted an essay to VU called Australia in the Holocaust, a Koori Perspective, and it doesn't pull any punches in considering those comparisons. The VU have it published on their site, and you can find it linked to the essay in the description for this video. Now, there are much more lengthy and in-depth works on the life and struggles of Cooper, including the book William Cooper, An Aboriginal Life Story by Bain Attwood. You can find links for those in the description as well. But I've situated Cooper's action in this series on Australian anti-fascism, well, obviously because it's a logical fit for one, and you'd be mad not to celebrate it, but also because any good activism of the anti-fascist sort must be place-based. I can meet a lot of would-be anti-fascists of the settler variety who are well-versed in the theoretical anarchist works of dead late 19th century European men, but none of that theory really means anything if we don't set about our activism by recognising where we are. Any activity anti-fascists do in Australia is conducted on stolen and unceded Indigenous land, no matter what they do. So if that continuing struggle doesn't affect the way that an anti-fascist goes about their praxis, then their praxis isn't worth a dime, in my view. No history of Australian anti-fascism really matters if it doesn't start out by recognising that Indigenous people came first. And what do I mean by that? I mean that in a few senses. They came first in the sense that they were literally living here first. They also came first in the sense that they were the first ones here forced to fight against brutal attempted genocide at the hands of the colony. And obviously they come first because they were quite literally, as it turns out, the first here to protest Nazis. And we can thank William Cooper for that. If you appreciate this kind of work and want to see more of it, then you can chuck me a dime, if you'd like, at patreon.com/TomTanaki. Cheers, thanks.